Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Grief and Gathering podcast, a podcast where we look at grief and all of its misconceptions through the lens of Magic the Gathering. The hope of this podcast is that by connecting grief to something that we all know and care about and are passionate about, maybe we can start to demystify this very weird and abstract experience that is grief. My name is Dr. Ivy Foxglove, and I am the host of this podcast. Last week we talked about what grief is, and we talked about perhaps one of the most influential and the most well-known examples of grief in this Magic the Gathering space, and that example being that of Liliana Vess. We looked at how she used necromancy as an escape, and we looked at her attempts at trying to avoid going through that grief experience. We talked about grief being like a wound on your heart and how, just like any other wound, when it is not healed, that wound can fester and things can get harder. It can make you hurt more, even though we know that healing and going through the journey of grief hurts. It fucking sucks, right? So today, we're going to be looking at a character who I think really does a great job of showcasing the cyclical nature of grief. And that character being Nashi, our lovely little ratkin who has just been one of the stars of our most recent story on Duskmourn and is just, I think, a very lovable and sweet character who also has a lot of history and a lot of story surrounding his experiences of grief. So for those of you who don't know, again, another brief rundown of this character. Nashi was born in a little swamp village in Kamigawa. At some point, Tezzeret and, big baddies attacked his village. His parents were killed, and he went from foster home to foster home. He kept leaving because he felt like his foster parents were always trying to replace his parents who died. And then he met Tamiyo, who insisted nothing more than that she call him, or that he call her, Tamiyo. And that was it. She made it very clear that she was not trying to replace Nashi's parents or anything of the sort. She just wanted to be a caretaker for him. And so he stuck around and he began to see her as a mother. And then fast forward to the Phyrexian invasion, where he actually saw, so Tamiyo was completed, and then he unfortunately witnessed Tamiyo's death. He has since tried to take up the mantle of storyteller, but his traumas and experiences continued to get in the way of really being able to tap into this full potential. And so that led him to Thunder Junction. It led him to eventually Duskmourn, where we last saw him. So that was a really rough and dirty kind of rundown of who Nashi is, and we'll continue to talk more about him. I am by no means a lore expert in this space, but I will link some of my favorite lore folks in the description of this because I think they do a much better job than I do. As always, before we get really heavy and we get to talking about this, I encourage all of you to do whatever you need to do to feel safe and be okay in this space, recognizing that grief is a hard thing to listen to for many people. And so if you're not in a space right now where this feels like something that you can manage or something that you can listen to, that's okay. I appreciate you hanging out here for the last 4.5 minutes. And if you want to peace on out now, that's okay. I totally understand. My biggest concern is making sure that you all are doing whatever you need to do to stay safe and feeling good and feeling like you're in a good mental space. But for those of you who want to stick around, let's dive right in. So as we know, Nashi's story is deeply, deeply intertwined with themes of grief and loss. And, I think in later episodes, we might look at things that maybe Magic and the story that it tells didn't do perfectly with portraying grief. But the one thing I feel like it did really well here is it showcased some of the lesser known pieces of grief. One being this thought of grief as a catalyst for change, right? One of my very dear friends, most of you probably know him, Hobbs Q, whenever we've been on panels or anything like that, he always asks this question to his guests: what made you spark? And I think that that's something that we can look at here with Nashi as an example too, of even these horrible, horrible things that we go through, that we experience, can sometimes be things that impact us in a way that it drives us in a certain direction. For me, one of my biggest sparks was the death of very close people in my life. People, my quote unquote adopted mother and father, both of their deaths were what drove me into focusing so heavily on grief work. What really made me passionate about grief and death and bereavement and all of those things, to where I've been able to devote so much of my life to this work. So grief as a catalyst is something I think we see a lot with Nashi, in that his whole identity, his story is surrounding grief. It's surrounding the death of his parents. It's surrounding the death of Tamio, wanting to take up her mantle, but also wanting to stay close to her. And he's doing all of these things from the lens of someone who is deeply impacted by grief. And I think this is both great and also not quite what we like to see. I think that grief, yes, can be an amazing, amazing catalyst for big change, amazing catalyst for positive change. And, grief can also become this all-encompassing thing where it feels like our lives have to be all grief all the time. And ever since Tamio died, I feel like that's kind of been how Nashi has been portrayed. Everything he does is influenced by grief. And while, yes, he's a fictional character who has a limited amount of screen time or literature time, whatever you want to call it, so it can make sense for him, But in the real world, in our world, I don't think that this is too dissimilar from the trap that some folks find themselves in when they're grieving. Because grief can feel all-encompassing. And you can feel like you're not allowed to take a break from grief. Sit with that sentence for a second, even. If you're someone who has been impacted by grief in your life, of any kind, of any sort, I would invite you to sit with that statement, taking a break from your grief. What comes up for you when I say something like that? A lot of people, they have a really negative initial reaction to that. And that's understandable, because it's easy to see taking a break from grief as being the same as moving on or forgetting about this person, or that you're done, that you're fixed, that you're healed, all of those things. But I don't think that's the case. One thing I try and hit home with my own grief journeys, with the folks that I work with, is that our lives don't have to be all grief all the time. And you get to a point where you can learn to set aside moments to feel your grief. You can set aside time to let yourself have those grief reactions. And just as importantly, it's important to set aside time where you're going to let yourself enjoy things. You're going to let yourself go and live your life. And that's so hard to do because we feel like everything we do has to be surrounding grief. And if our lives even start to have a semblance of normality, we're doing a disservice to our special person who died. And that's just not the case. Everyone's relationship with their special person was different. All of our special people who died have been different. All of the losses we've experienced in our lives have been different. And I've worked with a lot of people, a lot of clients, and not one person has ever told me that they think their special person who died would have wanted them to be sad for the rest of their life and would have wanted them to put their life on pause. More often than not, that's not what our special people want for us. Our special people want us to go and live our lives and experience joy and experience fulfillment. And I think that that's something we see Nashi come to at the end of Duskmorn too. When he gets to that point of letting go of something that was connecting him to Mio so that she was no longer being exploited. I don't want to, do spoilers because I don't know when this is going to come out. I don't know if folks are still going to be working through the Duskmorn story, but he has to make a big decision at the end of the Duskmorn story that, in a way, kind of separates him from his grief journey a little bit. And it forces him to accept that his life isn't just grief and that it's time to start having other experiences too. And that doesn't mean that he's not going to miss his mother anymore. Just like we don't miss our people who die. That's not something that we experience. Every day of my life, I miss my people who died. There isn't a day that goes by. Even now, all these years later, there isn't a day that goes by that I don't miss the people in my life who have died. And you get to a point where you can balance that with living. We have a saying in the grief community. It says, we don't move on from grief. We move with grief. We're always carrying grief with us in our backpacks, in our back pocket. We don't get to just move on from grief. We don't get to hit the end of our grief journey and be done. Rather, we learn how to go through our life carrying the grief with us. And that's something I think that the writers of Nashi's character and his stories have done really well. One of the big, common, horrible myths about grief is how there's 5 stages, right? And so a little bit of background, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came out. I think it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I don't remember. I think so. Came out with this theory of the 5 stages of grief. And people interpreted it to mean when you're grieving, you will experience a stage of denial and anger and depression and bargaining, and then finally acceptance. And once you've accepted the death, you're good. You're done grieving. You're all done. And it's this nice, neat line of stages. That's not true, even a little bit. And that isn't even what these original stages were meant to represent. Kubler-Ross created these stages for the use of terminally ill people. These were stages targeting folks who were dying, saying, hey, when someone is nearing the end of their life, here are 5 stages we can expect to see from them as they're getting ready to die. And has even since come out and said, don't use this as a guideline for grief because that's not what it is. And it's true, grief isn't linear. And I think that Nashi's story has shown that really well, that grief has its cycles. It goes ups and it goes downs. And we've seen that in all of his stories. He saw Tamio die after being completed, but then, got her memories and all of her scrolls and everything and got to feel attached to her again. And all of that was good. But then, oh, he's living the traumas of that and needed to find a way to boost his magic, and all of these ups and downs and ups and downs. That is what grief really looks like. And that we never hit to a point where we just say, yep, I'm done. Ugh, I'm glad I did that grief. I'm glad I've lived this experience. And now I don't have to do any more of it. That's not what we get to do. And oh my God, I wish it was. I wish it was. I wish that every single person who is grieving, we could say, hey, and guess what? On November 29th, you're going to wake up and you're going to say, holy shit, I'm done. I did it. I grieved. I'm done. Bye. But that's not how it goes. We all have our grief waves, and some of them are things that we can anticipate. Birthdays, anniversaries, special occasions, graduations, marriages, things like that. We know that these are going to be times when we will always miss our special people. Other times, it's completely unexpected. You know, you're walking through a grocery store and your special person's favorite song comes on the radio, and then next thing you know, you're crying in the frozen food aisle, hiding your head in pea freezer because you don't want people to see you sobbing next to all the frozen corn. And I might be speaking from experience there, but it's true. You know, that is what grief can really look like in a real world setting. We don't get to just have this nice and neat ending with our grief. So I think Nashi's portrayal of grief really, really shows how intricate this whole process can be, and how it doesn't have just one nice, neat line. You know, it can drive us to do different things. It can change who we are as a person. It will make us have our ups, have our downs. And most importantly, it's something that we never get over. We are never done grieving. But we learn how to live with our grief. We learn how to walk with our grief in the rest of our life journey. And that's what's important. And I think that's what the writers for Nashi were showing too, is that this is something we can do. And I think that that's a really important message to take home. Next time, we're going to be looking at more tricky, even trickier topic, this feeling of disenfranchised grief. This is those feelings of grief that maybe aren't always recognized. You know, everyone always recognizes parent death or a sibling death or things like that. But there's this whole other subset of grief called disenfranchised grief. And this is the grief that no one really feels like people get. It can feel very isolating to be amongst this group of disenfranchised grief, in that it can feel very isolating. You feel like people don't really get it. You feel like people don't hold as much weight to folks who experience death losses that maybe others don't deem as significant to what, you know, it might be like to experience the death of a parent or something like that. And we'll be looking at a few different characters again. I think one that comes to mind is Ajani and his relationship and his grief and his coping through his loss or perceived loss of Elspeth Tyrell, and then all of the things that have come through their connections and things like that. But thank you all so very much for listening. I really appreciate you all taking some time out of your day to hang out with me as we continue to use Magic the Gathering as a source of making our community, and therefore making our world, a little more grief aware. As this series continues, we're going to eventually branch out from grief. We're going to be talking about other tough topics as well. Really, the key and the goal, as always, being to make it so people at our gaming tables are met with folks who are empathetic and understanding and informed. So thank you for sitting with me through this part of your journey. If you are someone who is coping with grief, know that my heart is with you, and that you're not walking this journey alone. I love you all with all of my heart. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and we will see you next time, okay? Bye-bye.